Welcome, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Lynn Berger, host of Lynn Berger Interviews Remarkable People. And today I have the privilege of speaking with Michele Willens, a journalist, and currently she is writing a radio report on an NPR affiliate titled Stage Right or Not. Michele, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
So take us back to your earlier years. Did you know what you wanted to do?
I think I wanted to be on stage. All these years later, I'm doing a radio report, Stage Right or Not. You know, like every little girl, I think I wanted to perform. I went to a boarding school, and the teacher said to me at the end of the year, after I'd done all 3 plays and written some stories, he said, "Michele, I have news for you. You're not going to be an actress, you're going to be a writer." And that was the first time somebody really had recognized that I had that kind of talent. So I guess I stuck with that in a million different forms.
Which we'll hear about today. But when did it really start? Like, there was a letter you wrote to an editor?
Well, I always tell people, I learned the power of the media, so to speak, when I wrote a letter to Life magazine. They had done an article the week before on the best ice creams in the country. And my brother and I were fanatic Baskin-Robbins ice cream people, and that was not included. So I wrote a letter to the editor, never thought it would get printed, saying, compared to all the ones you mentioned, Baskin-Robbins, you know, is the best one, makes all the rest of yours look like chopped liver. That was my letter. And it was signed Michele Willens, LA. That's all it said, Los Angeles, California. So a few days later, this is true, I get a phone call like 10 at night from a woman, Ernestine, who said, "Michele, I can't believe that thing in the LA Times." And I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "I can't be the first person to tell you this." And I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Go to page 5 of the LA Times. There's half a page advertisement. Michele Willens, who are you? Where are you? Please call us from your friends at Baskin-Robbins." This is true. So the next day I called Baskin-Robbins.
General Baskin-Robbins telephone number?
It was their factory in California, and they invited me to come. And so I said, "Can my brother come with me? Because he'll have to drive me." I couldn't even drive. So we go out there, and I'm telling you, it's somewhere in the valley in LA. There was a sign, a block long, "Welcome Michele," over Baskin-Robbins factory. And every room we go to, they're standing and cheering for me. And as we leave, they said, "How big is your car?" And we said, "What?" And they said, come to our freezer, our store, take as much ice cream as you can and put it in your car. So that's kind of when I learned the power of the pen, so to speak.
That is a fabulous and delicious story.
It was good. I gained a little weight after that, yeah.
So lead us through what happened after.
Well, then what happened after? I don't know. That was, then I started, I went back and forth. I did a lot of politics as a young girl because my father was very involved with politics. And so I worked on some campaigns. We did a big thing for Daniel Ellsberg when he first came out with the Pentagon Papers. And I would kind of go back and forth between working on a liberal campaign and then, my first job was at the Santa Monica Evening Outlook as a copy girl. That was my first job. I left college after 1 year because I got very devastated by Bobby Kennedy being killed. My parents said, "Why don't you take a gap year?" And I did, but it turned out to be 40 gap years, but that's another story. But, so what did I do? I got a job as a copy girl at the Santa Monica newspaper, the local paper. So I'm a copy girl, but I noticed a guy over there, big guy named Raoul, and he was the entertainment editor, the only guy doing entertainment. And I said, "By the way, can I help you sometime if you ever need help on anything?" He was so happy. So he starts sending me to review movies, and then one day he said, "Hey, you want to go to Las Vegas and do Elvis Presley's first concert ever?" I said yes. So I went to Las Vegas.
How old were you?
I was about 20.
Wow, that's
I took a friend with me, and I still say it's the greatest. Amber, the whole town was just abuzz with. So I worked at the Outlook for a couple of years, and then the LA Times was picking me up. I did a lot of freelance everywhere. And I guess that was it. And then I got a job in television news. because I met somebody on a campaign, and he said he worked at a news station. They were looking for a writer. I said, oh, I'd love to write TV news. And it was during Watergate. So they put me on the Watergate beat. So I just had to watch the hearings and then write about them. And then, but my dream was to get to that was a small station. I wanted to go to a bigger station. So then a famous man named Bill Stout called me and said, hey, don't you want to work at CBS? I said, yes, please. And I went over to CBS News, the local CBS News. And that turned out to be, he hired me as a producer of a noon show and a writer on the news, but again, local news. And among other things, I met my husband, my eventual husband there. And I left that. I did that a few years. It's a famous story how I left and why I left. Because I had a girlfriend who had a very rich husband, and he was doing a dinner one night in California at the beach for a man named Jimmy Carter. Who was all we knew is he had been the governor of Georgia. And she said, my parents said I could bring one friend. You want to come over? And I said, sure. So I go to her house. There was just about 12 of us. Carter was on one end of the table. I was at this end. But he was so, inclusive. He would look at people and everything, and he'd look at me and always smile, and so would I smile back. And then after each course, they asked people to move over 2 seats.
Oh,
so they moved there.
that's a fun dinner.
And he got there, and then they one more time, another time, but we still were a catty corner. We weren't really. And then the party ended, and Jimmy Carter walks up to me, and he said, I kept wishing that they'd move us one more time. So the next day I walked into CBS News and I announced to everybody, okay, last night I had dinner with the next president of the United States. And I was laughed out of the newsroom. They said, what, that peanut farmer? And I said, if he could do for the country. And you know what? Then Carter's campaign asked me to be their press secretary for California.
Oh, that's a great story.
So I left CBS and I became his California press secretary. And after he lost, then I became a political writer, to be honest, and for several years, a pretty good one. Did some big stories for a political magazine there. I guess I freelanced for different places, including Money Magazine, which was a joke because I knew nothing about finances.
You learned quickly?
I guess so. They kind of liked that. They asked, one of the editors said, could you just come in and fill in for the summer? And I said, all right. I said, the only thing I know about bonds is James Bond. They said, we like that, we like that. We want people who don't know, For 9 years we were in New York. And I always thought I wanted to go back to California because that's where I was from. And so then my husband got a job in LA and we said, perfect, this is it, we're going back. And I had the daughter and I was pregnant with the son. And we went back and we thought forever. But a lot of things happened when we moved back. First of all, we owned a house in Malibu. We weren't living in it. We had renters, but we owned it. And it burned down. So we watched our house burn down on TV. Then
when was that?
Well, it was a long time, many fires ago. But it burned down. It was a big fire in Malibu. And that house burned down. Again, we were not in it. We had renters, but there it went. So that was the first bad thing. Then it was the time of O.J. Simpson, and the helicopters were all around, and that was kind of stressful for me, my kids. And then my husband was asked to come back to New York again. And I said, oh, no, not again. But after these things, and then there was a major earthquake. And I said, I give up. We're going back. So then we only ended spending about a couple of years in L.A., and we came back to New York, which is where we've been ever since. And I don't know, this theater beat came kind of out of nowhere. A friend called, the radio station called and said, we're looking for a reporter on theater. And I said, well, I guess I could do that. I mean, so it just meant.
Now that's recently.
That's what I've been doing that now, but it's been a while. That's probably been 10 years. I could tell you how long it's been, because this came up recently with the Academy Awards. I saw a play called Prodigal Son at City Center, and I was reviewing it. And it was about a young boy who went to a boarding school and got abused there. And the last line of my report, it was on the radio, the last line was, remember this name, Timothy Chalamet. So I'm very proud of that.
You made a big decision to go back to school. Is that correct?
I did when I came back here. How did that happen? That was a weird one. I was at Columbia for a funeral. I know that sounds weird. It was an editor's funeral. They did at Columbia. And I'd never been on Columbia. And I thought,
It's beautiful.
What a beautiful campus. And I was just sorry that my kids had not gone there or were not going. And I swear to God, I opened my email, and I had an email from the School of General Studies at Columbia reaching out, would I want to go back to school?
How did they get to you?
The only reason I thought of is that I was taking some classes in Marymount, and maybe they find out older people who might be, I don't know. And so then I got into School of General Studies, and I did that for 6 years, did about 23 classes. My husband liked it because he loved to brag to people. When they'd say, "Where's Michele?" He'd say, "Oh, she couldn't come, she's studying for her finals." You know, that was really hard. That was very hard. I learned a lot, and I met some great people. I still see two of my professors occasionally. One of them, Carol Gluck.
Oh.
She had a class called World War II in Memory, and I took 3 classes from her, and I reunited with her last year. We had breakfast together. I didn't even know if she'd remember me. She said, "Of course I remember you." She said, "I still remember the story you wrote for Nation magazine, and you read it to the class," and blah, blah, blah. I ended up writing about it, of course, for the New York Times, a famous piece that I wrote about, it was about being the oldest person, what it's like to suddenly be the oldest person in a room. And that was a very popular piece that
Oh, I'm
week in the New
sure.
York Times.
I'm
Yeah.
sure.
Because I was certainly the oldest person in every room, except maybe a teacher. I always say that article was the second most famous piece I ever did. The first one is after my Baskin-Robbins story and all that. I did a very famous piece. It was 1969, the last month of the year, and I sat down at home and I wrote about what had happened that decade to me, what had happened in the 60s. And I just read it to my parents, and my dad said, "I'm sending that to Art." He knew a guy at the opinion page at the LA Times. The next thing I know, that Sunday, they put me on the cover of the opinion page. They did a drawing of me. I still have it. And they called it A Child of the 60s. That made me very famous for about a year.
All right, well, that's lovely. Now, you're known for something. There's a word that came out because of you.
I do know that word. And I will say that if you Google me, matter of fact, I walked into my class at Columbia. I was in an English class, one of the first classes that I took there. And as I walked in, one of the kids yelled out, "Hey, Michele, did you really coin the term tweens?" And everybody looked at me, and I said, "I guess I did." I had written a piece. I did a lot of writing for the New York Times at one time, freelancing, by the way, LA and New York. And one of the pieces was about taking movies for that age group. And I guess I made up the word tweens. I never bragged about it. I never thought I did. But I guess I'll take credit for it, you know. So that term tweens.
It just came to you, or?
Well, I thought it sounded smart because I was about the kids that were not quite teenagers, and so I guess I did invent it. Like I say, nobody's ever questioned it in all these years, and it came up. You know, there were so many, listen, something happened this week that people are amazed about, and this is a famous story as well that's been written about many places, that I had a friend who was a singer. She had moved from Europe, but she was an American, and we became friends. And she had a beautiful voice. And her name was Lori Lieberman. I had lunch with her yesterday, believe it or not. She was in town. But Lori and I started writing songs together.
Oh, so you're a songwriter also. You didn't talk about that.
Yeah, I could write lyrics.
Yeah.
Lori knew how to play the guitar beautifully, and she has an incredible voice. I went to a club called the Troubadour in LA one night to see a singer named Don McLean, American Pie. And I was so incredibly moved that I called Lori and I said, you have to come with me tomorrow night. You have to come. She said, I don't want to come. I'm in a bad mood. Norman's breaking up with me. I just don't want to come. I said, Lori, you'll be sorry if you don't come. He was doing a second night. She came with me to the Troubadour. And as he's singing one song in particular called Empty Chairs, Lori gets out a napkin and starts writing on the napkin. He's writing like he knows me, like he's reading my diary. That's how she's notes. She gives those notes the next day to her. Oh, she had signed to do an album, first album, to her 2 songwriters. And what song do you think they wrote? Killing Me Softly with his song. So her album did nothing. Nobody knew Lori's album. But then Roberta Flack was on an airplane. Roberta Flack was on an airplane, and it was chosen by American Airlines as the album of the month. And Roberta Flack is listening to Lori singing that song. She got off the plane, she called Quincy Jones or whoever and said, I think I have my next song.
That's a great story.
And the rest is history. That's the second line of my obituary, right after Tweens. Killing me.
So let's get back to other things you're proud of.
Well, I'll tell you what I'm really proud of. That's a play that I wrote, co-wrote. I've also done a few plays that I've written. First was for young people called Dear Maudie. It was very successful in New York. It was for kids. It was about kids writing letters to each other or in class. And it got written up in the New York Times, and then it got published, and it was very successful, Dear Maudie, but that's fine. But then my best friend and I had tried for 20 years to write first a movie and then a play about the woman who was my hero. You asked who my hero was? Here's a name nobody will know. Helen Gahagan Douglas. Helen Gahagan Douglas was married to Melvyn Douglas. She was the most extraordinary woman. She was a star on Broadway. I didn't know any of this until much later. And then she became a congresswoman from California, ran for Senate in the most famous race in California history in 1949, I think I'm right, against Richard Nixon. And he called her the Pink Lady. It was the meanest, that's where he became Tricky Dick. It was the meanest race ever.
Pink Lady?
He called her, he was calling her a commie. So he was calling her a communist, called Melvyn Douglas anti-Semitic stuff. Anyway, I had heard about this through my parents at times. All of a sudden, Helen Gahagan Douglas was coming to LA to make the first appearance. Nobody had seen her in years. But she was coming to speak or something, and I got an assignment from LA Magazine to go talk to her and meet her. And then, of course, I wrote a little piece about her. And then for the rest of my life, including now, we are still trying to, we wrote a play called Don't Blame Me. I voted for Helen Gahagan Douglas, because they were wearing signs saying, don't blame me, I voted for Helen Gahagan Douglas, during Watergate. And when I interviewed her, it was during Watergate, but she was such a classy woman. She didn't want to say anything bad about Nixon. She just said, you know, I just feel bad for the country.
That's a nice way to say it.
That's what she said. I just feel bad for the country. She did not pick on him. But my friend Wendy and I, we did that. We wrote a play. We did it many places, but we always did it. We didn't have a real production. We did it as readings that were fundraisers. That was the idea, to raise money for causes we thought Helen would believe in. So we did some for Nation magazine, we did a health thing, because she was so ahead of her time on every issue, on health, on nuclear, you know, everything. Her speeches were unbelievable, and her husband, Melvyn Douglas, gave a speech for her the last night. She lost badly to Nixon. Anyway, we have tried forever, and I'm telling you, the next time we talk, maybe we'll have a play up somewhere, because we're still trying. Oh, we had Susan Sarandon who agreed to do it. I mean, we up, down, up, down, up, down. But Helen died, of course. And I wrote many pieces when she died. anytime I could find an angle. You know, when Ms. Magazine had their 50th anniversary, Helen had been their first cover girl. So I did a piece about Helen and Ms., you know. So my partner, Wendy Couch, says I have single-handedly kept Helen Gahagan Douglas alive.
And then there was a book of essays that you wrote?
Yeah, that I did do a couple of years ago, called From Mouseketeers to Menopause.
I love the title.
Well, I was such a Mickey Mouse Club fanatic. I watched every episode of Mickey Mouse Club.
Really?
Every episode. When a little girl.
Yes,
You know, as a
well,
little girl. Of course, very little. And I liked I wasn't even an Annette fan. I liked this little fat one named Sharon, was my hero. And I still have pictures of me sitting next to Sharon at Disneyland, because they would perform there. So I was a Mouseketeers fanatic. But then all these years later, people just kept saying, because I did have a lot of articles that I'd written, why not put them in a book? So the book became From Mouseketeers to Menopause, and it's very nice, I've got to say. It's got everything in there. It's got pieces that I've written about everything, you know.
Well, you've written about so many different things. When you look back, can you say what were your favorites? What are the topics that really got you going?
Well, you know, people always said I should write about my father, because he was an incredible man. My father was in World War II as a Japanese interpreter, and then he saw the results of Hiroshima. He came back to California. He became a very successful businessman, successful enough to retire young, young, 50 or something.
That's young.
And spend the rest of his life on anti-nuclear causes. And I mean big ones. He and Paul Newman, Jimmy Carter named the two of them delegates to the UN special session on disarmament. He and Paul Newman founded the Center for Defense Information together. They were buddies. Matter of fact, I was home one day visiting my father when he had decided, I'm done. No more causes, I'm done. And I believed him, I guess. And I was sitting with him, visiting him. By this time I was living in New York, but I was visiting him in LA. And the phone rang. And I picked up the phone, and Michele, I said, yeah. I said, this is Paul, as in Paul Newman. And I said, oh, hi. And he says, your dad there? And I said, yeah. So I gave the phone to my dad. And Paul said to him, come on, Harold, do you have one more fight? One more fight in you. Let's do one more fight. And the two of them basically saved Nation magazine, which was foundering badly. But Paul wanted to do that, and so did my dad. So, so they basically did that. And anyway, people have always said, why don't you write a book about your dad? But you know, I think when you read these essays, it almost is.
Okay.
Because he comes through so many of them. You know, he was such an influence in so many ways. Politics, caring, you know, great father and grandfather, and I don't know. So in a way, it is kind of about my dad, you know. One of the best essays I wrote was sitting at bars by myself, because my girlfriends would always say, what? You can do that because you know you have a husband at home. And I said, it has nothing to do with that. I like sitting at bars and talking to people. I mean, I was sitting at our local bar on the Upper East Side, I don't know, a year or two ago, and there's a guy next to me. Now, he was with his wife, but we're chatting about the neighborhood, something. And I don't know how somehow writing came up about Wall Street Journal. And he said, I used to write at the Wall Street Journal. I said, oh, what do you do now? He said, I write books. And I said, oh, really? I'm a big reader, anything I would know. And he said, do you know Devil in the White City? And I said, it's my favorite book ever. It was Eric Larson. So Eric Larson, we made a date for the next week so I could do a story on him, because he had a new project coming.
And he was at the bar also? He was
sitting at the bar with his wife.
Okay.
They do hang out at the same bar, by the way. I've seen him many times. He's pretty nice. He always says, hi, Michele. And he had an odd project coming out. And I said, can I interview you? He said, okay. So the next week we met back at the bar. And I did do a piece on him. No, I've made a lot of friends at bars. But yeah, if you're not interested, you've got to be curious, a little bit of an eavesdropper. You know,
yeah, a little nosy.
Little nosy. If I hear people saying, you know, and I say, oh, wait a minute, you know,
right.
I wrote that piece, or, you know, I know that. Yeah, I never, I never lose that. And one of the best stories that I did, there was for Nation magazine, but then it's in the book as well, was when, another thing was that my family was one of the first Americans in China to go to China. And that's another story, but because of my father, we were invited to China. My father, my mother, and I. This was 1971. This is right after Nixon opened it, right after. So there were no Americans. But we were invited, and we went. But as we were going, my father, we grew up in Santa Monica with these big swords on the wall, beautiful swords. I'm not even sure we ever asked him what the swords were. We weren't curious. And my dad said when we were going to China, he said, we're going to go to Japan first. I have something I want to do. Those swords he had taken as a favor for a young man in Japan, a favor, because they were all being confiscated. And he begged my father, can you take it back to America, these swords, just so I know they're safe, because they're family heirlooms. So we grew up with these swords. Then 40 years later or something, my dad says, I want to go to Japan and return these swords. He tracked down he had the guy's name, and I think a news bureau there helped him track down the man. Now the man was an older man, a businessman. And let me tell you, and they knew he was coming by that time. The LA Times wrote about him, and I guess he had worked it out in Japan. And we got off that airplane in Tokyo. There were camera crews everywhere. This was like a big deal. And then he had to go on TV the next day to physically.
Oh, that's a great story. Michele, these stories are so great. I want to thank you so much for being here. Chock full of stories.
Yes.
We could have spoken for another half an hour.
Maybe we will.
You say curiosity,
that's the
taking risks. Anything else? Like
curiosity, take risks, butt in when you feel it's time to, speak up, like Helen Gahagan Douglas did. Don't give up, but do it with kindness.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for spending this afternoon, early evening with me.
Thank you, Lynn.